You've tried the breathing exercises. Maybe you've done the therapy. Real therapy, not just 2 sessions before you decided it wasn't your thing. You showed up, you did the work, you got better at naming your patterns. You learned to notice when the spiral starts and to interrupt it. And none of that was useless. But the anxiety is still there. Not loud. Not the kind that keeps you from leaving the house. Just a low vibration underneath everything. A frequency your body can't unhear, no matter how many times you breathe in for 4 counts and out for 6. You've optimized your sleep. You've cut the caffeine. You've downloaded the app that was supposed to rewire your nervous system in 21 days. You've done what a reasonable person does when something is wrong. You've tried the treatments the culture recommends. And here you are. Nobody in the wellness industry will say this plainly, but there is a reason it isn't going away. You are treating a spiritual problem with a medical vocabulary. The diagnosis is precise. The treatment plan is rigorous. And it is aimed at the wrong disease. A poet who died in 1965 saw this coming. He named it before there was a word for it. And the prescription he arrived at, after a nervous breakdown, a conversion he almost couldn't make himself believe in, and 20 years of the most demanding poetry in the English language, is the exact opposite of what any self-help book will tell you to do. His name was T.S. Eliot. And what he understood about anxiety is something that took therapists the better part of a century to begin to catch up to. But we need to start not with the solution, we need to start with the specific shape of the problem. Think about the last time you sat in a waiting room. A doctor's office, an airport, anywhere, without picking up your phone, not as a meditation exercise, just because you forgot it, or the battery died, or some reason that didn't involve discipline. And you just sat there. What happened? For most people, what happens is not peace. What happens is a kind of low-grade distress that has no object. Nothing bad is occurring. There is no deadline bearing down, no conversation you're dreading. But the stillness itself feels uncomfortable, like standing on a floor that might give way. So you reach for the phone. Or you rehearse a conversation you already had. Or you make a list in your head of things you need to do. You generate movement, mental movement, if not physical, because stillness feels like something you need to escape from. The wellness industry's answer to this is to teach you to tolerate the stillness. Breathing exercises, grounding techniques, mindfulness practice. All of them are, at bottom, methods of making the stillness bearable. They are good methods. They are not wrong. But they don't answer the question of why the stillness is unbearable in the first place. That question is older than therapy, and the most precise answer to it was written in London in 1922 by a man who had just spent 3 months in a sanatorium in Switzerland. Thomas Stearns Eliot was 33 years old in the autumn of 1921, working as a clerk at Lloyd's Bank in London, and he was not functioning. The word his doctors used was nervous exhaustion. The marriage was in ruins. The work that mattered to him, the poems, the essays, had been squeezed into the edges of a life built entirely around other people's demands. And something had given way. Not dramatically, not in the way breakdowns appear in films. Just a quiet collapse of the capacity to keep going in the way he had been going. He went to a sanatorium in Lausanne, Switzerland, under the care of a neurologist named Roger Vitose. Vitose's method was unusual. He wasn't interested in talking about Eliot's problems. He was interested in what Eliot's attention was doing. His therapy was about the control of attention, the ability to place your mind somewhere deliberately, and keep it there without it running off into the past or the future. Not to feel better, not to process anything, just to be present to what was actually in front of you. Eliot came back from Lausanne with something. We know this because of what he produced almost immediately after returning. The poem we now call The Wasteland, which he finished in early 1922. This is where it gets interesting. If you went to a sanatorium and came back with a poem, you might expect that poem to be about recovery, about the light returning, about finding solid ground. The Wasteland is none of those things. It is, by almost any measure, the bleakest poem in modern English. It begins with a line that still lands like something cold. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire. He came back from getting help, and he wrote a poem about a world that cannot be helped. Hold that. Here is what the wasteland is actually about, beneath the difficulty and the footnotes and the reputation. It is not about war, though it was written in the shadow of war. It is not about London, though London is everywhere in it. It is about what happens to human beings when the structures that gave their lives meaning are gone, not destroyed suddenly, but hollowed out slowly over generations, until what remains is the outward form without the interior life. The people in the poem move, they go to work, they have conversations, they go through the motions of living. But they are, and this is Eliot's word from another poem he wrote around the same time, hollow, headpiece filled with straw. The anxiety they carry is not fear of a specific thing. It is the experience of being alive in a world where nothing is anchoring them. There is a line in the first section of The Wasteland that is one of the most honest lines ever written about this state. I will show you fear in a handful of dust, not fear of the war, not fear of poverty or illness or death exactly, fear in a handful of dust, fear of the ordinary, the inert, the empty, fear of the moment when you look at the actual substance of your life and find that it doesn't add up to anything you can name. This is the profile of the anxiety that doesn't respond to breathing exercises. It's not triggered by a threat. It's not a nervous system in alarm. It's the experience of being alive without a center, without a fixed point from which you can locate yourself, make sense of what's happening, or know what anything means. The world keeps turning, you keep moving, but there's nothing that isn't also moving. The therapist can help you manage the spiral. The therapist cannot install the center. Now, why did Eliot write this poem full of precisely this diagnosis and offer no solution? Why does The Wasteland end not with a way out, but with a shore of broken images? Because in 1922, he hadn't found the answer yet. It would take him 18 more years. And the path to it would go through a conversion he almost couldn't make himself believe in. Eliot became a member of the Church of England in 1927, at the age of 38. He had been moving toward it for years. Through Dante, through the mystics, through a slow erosion of his confidence that intelligence alone could hold a life together. The conversion was not a dramatic moment of light. By all accounts, it was quiet, deliberate, and more than a little frightening to him. He was not a man who found faith easy or comfortable. He was a man who had looked at every alternative and found them more dishonest. The poem he wrote in the years immediately after his conversion is called Ash Wednesday. And it begins in a way that might surprise you given that it's supposed to be a poem of faith. Because I do not hope to turn again. Because I do not hope. Because I do not hope to turn. This is not a triumphant conversion. This is someone trying to believe against the evidence of his own feelings. The mystics had a name for what he was in. They called it the dark night of the soul, and they were not embarrassed by it. They called it a stage, not a failure. A necessary passage through the absence of consolation towards something that would not depend on consolation to be real. And near the end of Ash Wednesday, there is a prayer. 2 lines. Teach us to care and not to care. Teach us to sit still. I want to stay with that last sentence for a moment, because it is easy to read as a piece of spiritual advice. Calm down, be still, relax. It is not that. It is the most radical prescription Eliot ever wrote. And it is the exact opposite of everything the modern wellness industry sells. The industry teaches you to manage the movement, to tolerate the stillness, to regulate the nervous system, to build hope and set goals and reframe your thoughts. All of that is aimed at making the turning world more bearable. Eliot is asking to be taught something different. He is asking to be taught to stop turning with it, to find the point that doesn't move. This is where we need to go to Four Quartets, to the poem he wrote 15 years later, when he had found the words for what he had been looking for. Before we get there, if what Eliot is describing resonates this sense that the problem goes deeper than your nervous system, what I've written is a guide called The Second Half, Eliot's framework for life after 55. It draws on the same arc we're tracing here. The late conversion, the Four Quartets, written at 47 through 55, the joy he found at 68, and applies it directly to the specific shape of anxiety in the second half of life. The link is in the description. Four Quartets is 4 long poems written between 1936 and 1942. Eliot was in his late 40s and early 50s when he wrote them. He was also, for much of that time, serving as a fire warden in London during the Blitz, walking the streets during the bombings, watching the city burn. The piece in those poems was not written in a monastery. It was written in the middle of the worst thing his civilization had experienced in living memory. That matters. I'll come back to why. The first of the 4 poems is called Burnt Norton. and it opens with a line that stops many readers cold the first time they encounter it. At the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards. At the still point there the dance is, but neither arrest nor movement. The still point of the turning world. This is not a metaphor for relaxation. Eliot is not describing a meditation technique or a mental state you achieve after 10 minutes with an app. He is describing something he believes is structurally true about reality, that there is a center to existence that does not move, and that everything else, every experience, every moment, every anxiety, every ordinary Tuesday, rotates around it. And then he writes this: humankind cannot bear very much reality. This is the diagnosis that changes everything, if you let it land. The assumption underneath every anxiety treatment is that the problem is too much. Too much stimulation, too much stress, too much noise, too much demand. So the treatment is reduction, less stimulus, more calm, more regulated, more managed. Eliot says the opposite. We are not anxious because there is too much reality. We are anxious because we cannot bear very much of it. We keep moving, generating thoughts, making plans, checking the phone, managing the symptoms, because stillness requires contact with what is actually real about our situation. And that contact is painful when you have no center from which to receive it. The mindfulness app offers you a moment of quiet by giving you less to process. Eliot is describing a state where you can bear more reality, not less, because you're receiving it from a fixed point, not from the spinning surface. The still point is not a technique. It is the thing the technique was always reaching for and could never produce on its own. Now, here is the inversion that makes this the hardest idea to explain and the most important to understand. When people hear, "find your center" or "find the still point," they assume the prescription is to go looking, to add a practice, to do something that will produce the centered state. Eliot says something different in East Coker, the second of the Four Quartets. I said to my soul, "Be still, and wait without hope. For hope would be hope for the wrong thing. Wait without love, for love would be love of the wrong thing. There is yet faith, but the faith and the love and the hope are all in the waiting. Wait without hope." This is the sentence that breaks the entire framework of self-improvement. Not because hope is bad, because hope for the wrong thing. Hope that the anxiety will go away, hope that the right technique will finally work, hope that the feeling will eventually be replaced by a better one, keeps you turning. It keeps you on the surface of the problem, looking for movement that will solve it, when the solution is not movement at all. The waiting Eliot describes is not passive. He is not telling you to give up. He is describing a posture of active availability, a stillness that isn't escape but orientation. You stop generating movement toward the wrong thing, and in the stopping, something becomes visible that the movement was always obscuring. The dance, as Eliot puts it, is at the still point, not in spite of the stillness, because of it. Now I need to tell you why Eliot wrote Four Quartets during the Blitz, because this is the answer to the question I left open earlier. How does a man who wrote the most desolate poem of the century end up at peace? And why did the peace arrive not in comfortable circumstances, but in the middle of bombs falling on London? Eliot was a fire warden. He walked the streets at night when the city was burning. He watched buildings he knew disappear. He was in his late 40s, the marriage that had nearly destroyed him years behind him, alone, carrying the weight of everything he'd built and believed. And he wrote poems about the still point. I think the answer is that the Blitz made the question unavoidable. When everything exterior is turning, when the world is quite literally on fire, the question of whether there is a point that doesn't move becomes the only question worth asking. You can't manage your way through a Blitz. You can't optimize your sleep schedule when the sirens are going off. The only thing left is the question of whether there is something in you or in the structure of reality, which is what Eliot believed. That stands apart from the chaos, something that the chaos can't reach. And what Eliot found, not as a theory but as something he tested against the worst circumstances available, was that the still point is not a feeling. It is not a state you achieve. It is more like a direction, a constant orientation toward the center, rather than toward the surface. And that orientation doesn't prevent suffering. It changes the ground on which suffering happens. The anxiety doesn't vanish, but it stops being the floor. Here is what this means for you. If you are in your 50s or 60s, you have something that a 35-year-old in therapy doesn't have yet: the evidence of your own life. You've tried the techniques. You know the limits of what they can do. The frustration you feel, the sense that something is still wrong even when everything is managed, that frustration is not a sign of failure. It's a sign that you've been asking the right question in the wrong building. The right question is not, how do I reduce the anxiety? The right question is, what is the center I've been circling without being able to reach? Eliot found his way to an answer late. He was converted at 38, which he called late. He wrote Four Quartets in his late 40s and early 50s. His greatest work, by most accounts, arriving after what he once described as years he considered largely wasted. And at 68, he married a woman named Valerie Fletcher and said the years that followed were the happiest of his life. That's not a motivational story. I'm not telling you it gets better if you believe hard enough. I'm telling you that the man who wrote the most precise diagnosis of modern spiritual emptiness, written out of his own experience of it, found that the diagnosis, accepted honestly, is the beginning of something, not the end. The still point doesn't get easier to reach because you're older. But you may be more willing, finally, to stop moving toward the wrong things. And that willingness is something. If you've sat with a low vibration long enough to be tired of managing it, tell me how long it's been. I read these. The question that stays after this video is not about Eliot, and it's not about therapy. It's simpler than that. What is the thing you keep moving toward in the hope that it will quiet the vibration? And what would it mean to stop, not to give up, but to stop long enough to find out whether the center is already there? Eliot believed it was. He tested the belief in fire, and he called what he found the still point of the turning world, where the dance is.